Hey, thanks for joining us for Pact. P is for Peter. This is Ms. Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. That's ACD. If you're interested in supporting us, subscribe and follow here on YouTube or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Audible. Tell your friends about our little politics show as well. If you really want to help us out, become a patron at patreon.com/PeterCoffin or click the join button below. Either way, joining gets you into the Discord server, gets you exclusive content, and you see some content before everyone else. We stream at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every Friday. Thank you very much for tuning in. What do people think systemic means?
Okay, the reason that we bring that up is because we feel like when talking about ideological bias, whether it's racism or patriarchy or queerphobia or xenophobia, what have you, politicians or individuals who either wax progressive or who self-identify as progressive or who think they're socialists use that word systemic to signify that they're talking about a large issue.
Yeah.
And what sparked this conversation was a tweet by Ilhan Omar that says, funding body cameras, funding more trainings, funding updated use of force guidelines. All that funding and reform hasn't stopped the police from killing people or making our communities safer. The problem is systemic and it requires systemic solutions.
It was something that was tweeted because a black 13-year-old child was killed by the police while the trial of the officer that killed George Floyd was still going on. Basically, that contextualized Ilhan Omar tweeting this.
Which, the first part is completely correct, in that the funding of all of these things is not something that is going to promote the efficacy of the police force for what it claims to do.
Mm-hmm.
Then she says the problem is systemic and it requires systemic solutions without presenting a definition of what that is or proposing what that would mean. Training doesn't fix a broken system is a way that somebody responded to it, yes. Strangely enough, though, I did not see anything outside of this or have never heard her say anything about dismantling the
capitalist state.
Yeah. The economic base on which this subsides.
You mean a politician that got elected in the United States hasn't explicitly called for dismantling the state?
Right. Right. Here's why it's important that Ilhan Omar says this is a systemic problem. And Robin DiAngelo says this is a systemic problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then talks about...
That's exactly... You've pretty much said the whole thing by just saying that, to be clear.
That we can essentially... The problem is systemic and it requires systemic solutions.
Systemic has become a buzzword. That's what we're saying here.
And what systemic actually refers to in this context, in Marxist terms, it would be what we refer to as the base, or the mode of production, but off of which the entire society is operating, from which emerges ideology, including the ones that we're talking about now, including racism and bigotry and patriarchy and all of these things and the things that justify it. And from that emerges culture, our way of life, our way of interacting with people, the mode of our relationships and how that works. That's all emergent from the base. When you see an electoral politician say that something requires systemic solutions and then does not propose anything after that.
Yeah, it's a single tweet. This is not a thread, to be clear.
Yeah.
What she's basically saying is that it's complicated, but then she doesn't explain how it is complicated. It is emptying out the word systemic. It's changing it from something that means something to something that signifies that she knows more than you know.
Right.
You brought up Robin DiAngelo, the White Fragility book's author. She uses the word systemic on a near nonstop basis in the White Fragility book. It is a constant looming factor. But the thing that you eventually figure out is that to Robin DiAngelo, and ostensibly to a lot of the liberals that subscribe to the same kind of ideology, systemic racism means there are people that occupy the system who are racist. And that is not what it means.
Right. Obviously not, because in the example of race, the reason that exists is to justify the existence of the base.
Exactly.
So an electoral politician who self-identifies as progressive and says that police brutality is a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions, what is she going to do about that? Is she going to undermine the office of the United States government? She is criticizing the idea of reform, and yet automatically in her role and what she's purporting to do, working within, being funded herself by the systemic environment of the United States government and of the capitalistic structure, that's a problem, unless she's about to do something really drastic tomorrow.
Unless tomorrow some things change really significantly, which they're not.
They're not going to, because, and now we can talk about the state.
It's really important that we understand what the state is when we talk about this type of thing. When we see a state actor who is not outlining what the state is and not calling for the dismantling of the capitalist state, what we're getting is them wrapping the function of reform in the language of revolution. But again, the word systemic has been diluted so much because we don't know what the system is, meaning we don't know what the state is. So the state is an apparatus that exists to maintain class society. That is the most simple version of it. Now, if we were talking about a capitalist state, the state exists to maintain the class society that exists within capitalism, which is capital holders versus everyone else.
What the function of the police is to do that, and in Leninist terms, is to protect that, is to protect the state, and in this case, to protect by proxy the capitalist class structure, regardless of the individual agents who are implicated in doing this. My problem with it is that I've never seen even the most leftist, progressive identifying politicians say that there's a systemic problem and it requires systemic solutions, and then threatening the capitalistic structure. Then I get stuck there too, because it's like, okay, if she outlined that and like verbalized that and advocated for that, I would say, okay, then what the fuck are you doing, bitch? Like, why are you in the United States electorate?
Well, and that's really the problem here, though. Would you disagree with a progressive that, like, let's say racism needs to go? No. Would you disagree with a liberal that trans issues are important? No. However, they do not outline any of the mechanics of why those things exist. They don't outline what they serve. They don't put forward a program that would change society fundamentally away from how that works. And that is the criticism here. We see so many people using the word systemic, and yet no one outlining what a system is, no one talking about what the state is, no one talking about how fundamental of a change is necessary.
I thought of an example in my department in individuals that I work pretty closely with in attempting to dismantle racism as it is manifest in our own department. There was a recent like mass call out basically of faculty in our department and how they're not doing enough and how they need to do better in these sorts of things, saying if we want to counteract systemic racism specifically, and they'll use that word while calling out a group of individuals that is baked within the for-profit university system. And I don't want to say too much, but I mean, like, one of them responded and was like, you know, this doesn't excuse my own silence on the matter, but like, I work with patients and their families every day, and like I have like genuinely like
no,
saying,
I'm not
like,
laughing like it's dumb. I'm saying like
my
of course
my burden and caseload, like I do experience burnout, and that is like relevant to the way that this is being presented to me, and I felt for this person who responded to this because what does It's calling out individuals for not stopping systemic racism, which is just...
Which, I mean, it plays right back into that white fragility framing of systemic racism, which is the idea that if we could just replace the racists that occupy positions of power within the system, then the system would cease to be racist, because that's the only problem. But that's not it at all.
And I think this is even a good example, because we're still seeing manifestations of systemic racism in, like, my department, and probably, like, most departments in my field. Like, the overarching ideology that we subscribe to is, like, a very anti-racist program. But this is an example, and Peter can elaborate on this, and that it doesn't matter if every single individual is a non-racist or even, self-identifying anti-racist person. You will still see the manifestations of the effects of something that is baked into our interactions and mode of operations in a system or a society or a department or whatever.
So it's exactly true that there doesn't have to even be a single racist involved. Like, everybody, individually speaking, can be totally non-racist, anti-racist, etc. Let's talk about the cloistering of demographics in terms of race and class. Ideologically speaking, there are various reasons why Black people are banished into the working and poor class. Like, if you talk to a really, like, hardcore far-right person, they will tell you it's because they're, like, fundamentally have some kind of problem.
But it's because racism is a justifying ideology of the class structure.
Exactly.
It's literally how capitalism happened.
In the United States of America, particularly.
On the backs of slaves.
Race and race science exist to justify why you can enslave Black people. People thought, oh, they're not really actually people like we are. So enslaving them is like making, an ox hoe a field or whatever. It was wrong, obviously, but that type of ideology persists over the course of decades.
Well, centuries.
Centuries, yes. When they abolished slavery, when they played at abolishing slavery.
Right.
Because the prison loophole.
Yeah.
When they did that, Black people started at zero. On top of that, they were also operating with, like, Jim Crow, the various types of discriminatory issues baked into, like, the New Deal, all the way up through the 1960s, where, in theory, that was all solved. Which, again, that stuff did not solve everything, because it didn't actually address where Black people are, materially speaking. It only said, hey, well, you can't do this, this, and this to Black people anymore. So the justifications that worked to make it so that they are enslaved still exist within the collective ideology of the United States. The material holding back and banishment to a specific class position. Black people get cloistered into certain areas. Those areas are low rent. Those areas do not get ahead. There are a lot of people who are not connected to institutional power in any way. And ultimately, you have working class Black people, poor people, cloistered together. So anything that happens to the Black people in that area, regardless of any individual's ideology, is a result of systemic racism, because the system has ultimately cloistered them together as a class and as a race. So if a police officer goes in there, a totally non-racist one, hell, a Black one, goes in there and shoots somebody due to trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill or whatever, it's still a result of systemic racism. It has nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with the fact that, materially speaking, Black people have been put in a specific position. Now, this also applies to the Amazon unionizing stuff. I heard some people saying the idea that even though the people in Alabama who were trying to unionize at the Amazon warehouse were majority Black, it wasn't a race-related issue. But that's not true, because there's a reason why Amazon decided to put a warehouse in an area that would draw mostly Black people. It's because the incomes in that area are low enough that you can attract people to a non-union job in which you have to pee in fucking water bottles. Even if at Amazon, there's not a damn racist at all. By the books, by the numbers, by the material conditions, people of a specific race have been specifically marginalized, specifically targeted, regardless of any individual's decisions.
Like Peter said, if every single police officer was an anti-racist person,
be a woke babe.
But what the police force does is exist specifically to protect and maintain the capitalist structure, which perpetuates, sustains, and will continue to sustain racialized material hierarchy in the United States. And the result of that is residential segregation, the clustering of low-income people or low socioeconomic status people by race, essentially, in the context of 20th century gentrification, white flight, and redlining. All of those things uphold, as a result, in the superstructure of racialized ideology because they're emerging from the capitalistic base. And so the police, when trying to maintain, whether it's they're purporting that they're maintaining law and order, whether it's that they're promoting community safety, whatever it is, they're going to be in places, whether it's crime and poverty, whether it's completely innocent civilian acts, but in dilapidated areas where they act accordingly to what their bias baked into them is. No matter what happens, even if they're the most self-identifying anti-racist cop in the world, their job and what that job actually is, whether it's what they purport it to be or not, is to protect and serve racism because they protect and serve the state. And this actually does kind of have to do with the training bit. The reason that the trainings are the way that they are, where police officers are being confronted with simulations of children and pregnant women with guns, is because what the police force does to protect the state, from that, the ideology that supports cop training is treating civilians like they are enemies.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they are, if threatening to structures or revolutionary attitudes, all of those things increase that feeling of threat for a police officer because what they're trained to do is to see that as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So going into a community where there's a lot of crime, it's very low income, has very poor infrastructure, high racial and ethnic minority population, which is actually in some like county level analyses like a really strong indicator of poverty or class, which they've written a lot about now. When they're in those areas, of course they're going to be likely to kill Black people.
Well, yeah, I mean...
They're going to have to, because they have to perceive everybody there as a threat, and cops are going to be more populous in places where there are more racial and ethnic minorities, because they have the least power within the capitalist class structure, which puts them in closer vicinity to the police.
It's this endless cycle that is baked into the structure, and that's what systemic means. It's not, again, the white fragility view in which people who are racist have power and are able to make decisions that are racist. No.
Which, an electoral system only allows such strong people into it. If they were any stronger with their belief system or more leftist or more explicitly communist, they would not be where they are, because that system would not permit somebody like that or somebody expressing those ideas and trying to actively implement those initiatives. They wouldn't get there. They wouldn't exist. I mean, Bernie wasn't even that. And
yeah.
They couldn't do that.
Again, Bernie is such a perfect example. Bernie was clearly beyond the confines of what the system deemed acceptable because he was going to win, and they just rearranged the entire race on him. They just said, no, you're not. You're not going to win. We're not going to let that happen. And if you think that they just, like, coincidentally all dropped out the day before Super Tuesday, you're naive. Obama made the call. And I'm not joking. Obama actually made the call.
Obama literally made a perfect phone call.
He literally called Pete Buttigieg while on a plane and was like, listen, you gotta drop out.
Ilhan Omar, if she said something that was advocating for a systemic solution, she would be yeeted. It's not possible for somebody in her position to advocate for real systemic solutions without just using that as a buzzword to make her seem like a progressive person who is advocating for the right thing, because she wouldn't be there if she could.
That's all for today. Thanks again for watching. This is Pact. I'm Peter. This is Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. To help us out, click like, follow, subscribe, whatever. Leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Audible. To support us, become a YouTube member by clicking join on the YouTube channel, or become a patron at patreon.com/PeterCoffin. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you later.
Bye.